you can take your proactiveness and pop it up a level and be a little meta about it and be like, okay, and this is something that I recommend a lot of engineering leaders do, is look at your risks. And I actually recommend people maintain a risk list of these are the things that could go wrong based on the information that I have. And some of these could be perhaps very significant.
Hey everyone, today we are talking about a very interesting topic, company stage appropriate processes with Don Neufeld. Hey Don, thanks for being on Scaling Tech today.
Hey Debbie, thanks so much for having me.
So before we jump into this topic, which I love, a little bit about Don for those that don't know you. So Don is the VPE Coach, the Vice President Engineering Coach. You're an executive coach for many startup engineering leaders because you've done the job, right? And I think that's what makes you such an effective coach, right? So you've been an executive at every stage startup, really, from founder all the way through, from founding company all the way through IPO, including CTO of Medium, VP Eng at ClassPass, and VP Eng at Chartboost. So really excited to have you. And so I want to jump in by, let's set the stage. What do we mean by stage appropriate process, and why is it so important?
Great question. I think that maybe one of the best ways to understand stage appropriate process is to talk about what it's not, which is that there's a lot of things you might read about engineering practices or HR practices when you're building a company. And some of those things are from, let's say, very large companies, Google, Meta, et cetera. And it can be really feel like that's the right way to do it. And that's the opposite of a stage appropriate process. A stage appropriate process is the right process for you, not some abstract, correct, best process. And this, especially in engineering, this can be really challenging because engineers really want to do things the right way. And so the idea of having an optimal or best process is very attractive to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I even throughout my career, I've worked from startups through companies that have IPO'd, and it's really a struggle because it's you think you want to like follow in the footsteps of giants, right? But you might not right this minute, right? So I love that you framed what it's not. And so let's say I'm an engineering leader, and you had said to me before this conversation that a lot of engineering leaders just kind of want the answer, like, what should our process be? And it is not a one size fits all answer because of what you just said. So how do you answer this, and how do you help engineering leaders navigate this?
That's a great question. And when I'm working with clients on this, we really start with looking at the landscape of what their pain points are now, because any process that you're going to have serves a purpose. And I think that's where it can be easy to lose track of that when you're sort of reading or modeling other companies, because you don't see their why. You don't see why a big company might have like a promotion committee, or might have, a particular hiring process where maybe the engineer doesn't know what team they're going to join before. Like those have different whys behind them than you would have as a small company. So we start with the pain points that they're actually experiencing. And this can be, again, going back to sort of like engineers and the way we are, is very frustrating to us because we try to anticipate problems and get out in front of them so that we don't have pain. But that actually can often turn into us solving the wrong problem. And so one of the ways to figure out, what are the right processes for you is to look around and like, what's not working and which of those are costing us enough to be worth it? Because process is not free. I'm sure we've all had our experiences of onerous processes, whether they're the company we worked in or perhaps some entity that we had to interact with. And so whenever we're taking those things into our business, we need to make a trade, and that trade needs to be worth it.
Yeah, it's interesting as you're talking about this, I'm recalling many times in my career I've been tempted to follow the performance review process and the hiring process of companies like Google, like LinkedIn. And so let's say you're an engineering leader and you say, okay, my performance review process or my hiring process is broken. Is it then, it's not then true, right? Then you then need to adapt the ones that Google does, because that is like maybe you might overdo it, right? I mean, it's okay. So you identify your process, and that's how you know you need to implement stage appropriate process because
Hmm.
something's broken. How do you know what kind of jump or leap or step to take when the big companies have lots of marketing and they put their messaging out there? This is what worked for us, right? And so that's very easy to find. So how do you then know what step to take once you identify where to dive in and okay, I'm going to take this cost hit, process change is not free. What stage, how do I ladder up, if you will?
Well, if you're looking for comparables, I think
Yeah.
that looking at things that other companies that have similar sizes can be a much better starting place than sort of big tech. And so if you're a Series B company and you have 30 people on your engineering team, then looking for things that have been written by the leaders of similar or maybe slightly larger companies will be helpful in you informing your own sort of assessment of what my options are. Because there's the purpose here is not to reinvent the wheel every time you have a new thing. Like there's value in understanding what other people have done and the consequences of what they have done. It can be useful and to see around corners, like what are the implications of this going to be if I do it. Um,
Yeah.
but the comps have to be relevant.
Right.
Just like, if you ask a realtor, what's my house work? They're going to look around your neighborhood. They're not going to look,
Right.
in another city, even though that's a similar size house. It's just, not relevant.
So that's a really great analogy. And so who are our realtors, right? I mean, coaches like yourself are a really valuable piece of information because the comparables, we might not be able to find those in our everyday life, right? If you're lucky enough to be a portfolio company of a VC company, maybe you can have access to those engineering leaders, but and that's part of why we're doing this podcast. A big part of it are like let's share a peek underneath the hood in areas that are hard to find, right? And so working with someone like yourself is, I think, a really valuable way. But how else can engineering leaders find those comparables, find those, the broker who can give us the answer and connect us?
Well, I think, um, having community is tremendously valuable. You sort of alluded to one form of community in that, if you're a VC-backed company, going to your investors and asking them to connect you can be very, very effective. Typically, when you're building a company, you choose funds to invest in you that will focus on your stage. So it's likely that they will have comparable companies that they can introduce you to. And some of them even run, I've been part of various groups that venture firms have run to come in and speak to them, where they get a dozen or so heads of engineering or other sort of function leaders together to share knowledge and learn from each other. So there may be sort of VC-run communities you can join. There's also a number of communities out there, like 106 Miles, for example, is a community that focuses on best practices for early stage companies. And so some of those things. But if you don't have access to any of those, trying to connect with technical peers at the same kind of stage companies, I think is a very effective way, going to meetups, trying to really build that personal network.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think I'm seeing a lot of renewed energy in the CTO clubs throughout the country. And there's 8 or 9 of them, and they gather often, and they're really focused on being a true safe space for peers. And so, and even through the CTO connection, right, the CTO summits. And so there are the last few years has been tougher to come by these sorts of communities if you don't already pre-exist with one. But I really support what you're saying, and I'm a big proponent of that. So that's certainly something. If folks are, hesitant to spend a lot of time, try to find something, to attend, or, again, like podcasts, peer groups, coaches, get out and find your peer group. So let's say we do that, we upgrade our process. How do we know if we've overshot it, right? If we think we didn't do the Google or the Spotify, and like Spotify is a great example. Like, so many people have adopted squads and guilds and tribes, and too soon, right? And so how do you know when you've overshot, or if you've overshot?
So I guess I've got a couple of ideas for how to detect that. One is sort of to connect your process, whatever it is. So imagine that you were a leader, and rather than building the organization, you were hired in, and you were doing an evaluation of a sort of situation in progress. You would look at each part and ask questions like, okay, why is this here? How can I tell if it's working? And what is that metric or that survey telling me about its effectiveness? So I think there's one approach like that to kind of go back to the why, and the other I think would be, let's take the Spotify model for example. Is if you've got something like that off the shelf, you should get a sense from the community of like, how does this look like when it's working? For example, one of the reasons that the Spotify model has challenges at small scale is that the pods are so small that you don't have enough engineers so that you can actually get a lot of work done in the group, because your total headcount in the company is just very small. So you've sort of cut things too fine, you might say. And so you'll see side effects. And a side effect of that would be, for example, when an engineer goes on vacation, like a pod stops being able to get work done because they're the only mobile engineer. And so for 2 weeks, like the pod can't get any work done. Like, you'll see some negative effects. And I'm really, there's a lot to be said for being proactive as a leader, but there's also something to be said for taking a step back and waiting for things to be needed. Because when you're responding to what the situation is actually telling you, rather than you anticipating what it might need in the future, you're more likely to do things that are actually going to be valuable.
That's when you said that, I had like an internal reaction of anxiety. And I think that, like, some people will hear this and be relieved that it's okay to do that because that's the way they've always done it. And some people will get anxious because they fear having to let go of the way they've always done things. And so I appreciate you saying that, because I think it's how you show up and how you support and what you do proactively and what you do reactively. I think all of those kind of tactics, because if you don't wait to see what's needed, you might power through and never take that time to know that you've overshot, right? You might.
Another way to look at it is to say, like, it's a form of listening. And, if you had a leader that wasn't listening, you might expect that they would take some missteps and, maybe the team would have some frustrations, versus a leader that is listening. But I love what you had to say there about, like, oh, that gives me some anxiety. And I think you're right, because there are different implications to some of these things going off the rails, or having certain pain points. You don't want the pain point that your customer data is for sale on the dark web. That's a very not attractive pain point. Very difficult to solve that one. Some companies might call that like a one-way door. So you can take your proactiveness and pop it up a level and be a little meta about it and be like, okay, and this is something that I recommend a lot of engineering leaders do, is look at your risks. And I actually recommend people maintain a risk list of, these are the things that could go wrong based on the information that I have. And some of these could be perhaps very significant. For example, as engineering leaders, we tend to focus on technical problems. That's very attractive to us. But it's pretty easy to iterate on, let's say, your dev process compared to maybe your salary structure. So getting your compensation structure wrong can be a very expensive thing to fix later versus, we needed to change how we do deploys or how we do all these other things. We're drawn to that technical challenge, and maybe we're not drawn to the people challenge, but the cost of getting the people challenge wrong is so much larger. So if you look at this from a risk point of view, you're like, oh, maybe that pushes my attention to the things that I'm otherwise avoiding, but really do need a little bit of that proactiveness, because fixing it after it's broken is just too costly on that one.
Right. And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because that ties nicely into my next curiosity, which was like, can you scale back if you've overshot? And you're just talking about, well, it depends on what you've overshot on, because if you've overshot on compensation, sure, you can, but
consequences will be significant. Yes.
right.
And I think, that's something that we've been going through as an industry, is that, maybe in some cases, we need to rethink some of our compensation. And wow, that's hard. That's a difficult ask for people to get on board with. So how do you know if you've overshot? There's going to be some side effects. In that case, maybe like your investors are like, hey, we're paying people too much, or, something like that would be your side effect. But you'll start to get some signal that will indicate, oh, this process is not working for us. And it could be as simple as engineers are unhappy. They feel like it's really bureaucratic. Okay, like, let's dig into that. What is going on there, and what can we change that would be worth it?
And so even within that is a process, because I'm wondering, how do you know if your employees, your engineers are unhappy? And even that is a process. It could be a verbal ask. It could be a survey. It could be right. Like there's even mechanisms that are very heavy or very light to either gather those side effects. Right. If you're one team around a table or a Zoom, maybe, you could tell if someone's unhappy. But if you're, a 500 person engineering team, you're not going to see people every day. Right. So even gathering that feedback. So, all right. So if you have a risk list and you wait for your pain points and you try to make that laddered step and that stage appropriate next step, and you're looking for that feedback, is there any sort of, what have you seen work best in terms of looking for those signals when you're like a growing, tech company? Is it like lightweight anecdotal, or is it kind of apples to apples measuring trends over time, or does that also depend?
So I think humans are, there's some data around this. We're not great at making absolute sort of like judgments in terms of like on a scale of like, 1 to 10, how happy are you? That's a difficult thing for people to answer reliably in a way that seems to correlate with what's going on for them. We're better at comparing things. So one technique that I like to use is to ask people, let's say in the context of process, do you feel that it's better, worse, or the same than it was 3 months ago? So the benchmark is something that is relevant, like not too far. If you ask them, let's say, how's our process compared to another company you worked at? Could be a very different kind of environment there. You come from a big company to a startup, you're going to have a lot to say, but are those necessarily helpful here? So leveraging that ability to make relative judgments rather than absolute is, I think, a technique you can use. And it's so interesting that you mentioned that, like, yeah, the way that we learn things changes as the company scales. And in fact, that I think is one of the biggest drivers of how these processes have to change, is that we can only maintain so many relationships, especially like sort of the high bandwidth ones where we're getting a lot of information. And so as the number of people in the company goes up, we just, naturally can no longer keep up, and we need to create structure, and we need to create information flows and associated processes. But if we
So,
take all that complexity
right,
and we stick it in a small company, we're just like, we're solving a problem they don't have.
right. And so so I'm gonna go the other way now because I think it's very relevant. So what if everything's going fine, you're growing and you're scaling your process to map and you're within shooting distance and you haven't overshot or undershot and everything's going well. And then the size of your company gets cut in half. Maybe you do several rounds of layoff, which is happening, as we speak. What if you sell off part of your company, and you go the other way, right? Now you have this process that everyone's used to
Mm-hmm.
and is bought into and is comforted by, but really it is no longer stage appropriate process. It's no longer stage appropriate overnight.
Yeah.
Well, what do you do in that case?
Well, I think that you need to do a really significant reevaluation rather than sort of assuming that things are going to be okay and maybe going through this over a period of multiple quarters or years. Is step back and really look at the whole situation. And I'm thinking particularly here about, companies have a tendency when they go through these kind of things to maybe preserve the number of layers, but that's no longer necessary. You end up with a very vertical org structure where you might have a director with two teams, and then those two, teams are, relatively small. And so you go like, okay, like, why do we have a director layer here at all? Maybe we can just have managers reporting into, the head of the function. And so I think as a leadership team, when you're going through that kind of significant change, you can't be too precious about what you're doing now, because you'll miss some necessary changes like that I think are then going to be really painful to sort of iterate towards. Um,
I've lived through that a while ago, and it was painful because it took a very long time for that realization to surface.
yeah.
We were turning over all the wrong rocks, and then we're like, wait, it's us. Right?
Get blame. Oh, it was me.
Right. My job is that's it. It's like my job is no longer needed. Right.
Yeah.
And that's really that takes a lot of self-reflection, and I've seen it firsthand. I've seen it secondhand where you have a very healthy leverage mix and all of a sudden goes boom. And
Yeah. It's
just
scary. It
yeah.
takes a tremendous amount of maturity as a leader, especially if one of the conclusions there that maybe that it's you, or perhaps it's people that you brought into the organization, people you care about. There can be a lot of sort of personal parts to that too. It's hard.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I really am latching on to some of these interesting kind of takeaways that you've shared with us today in terms of really keeping a risk list, really thinking about comparables and finding community to assess those comparables, how to think about when you do downsize, if you do downsize, how to readjust or when to readjust. And so these have been really powerful takeaways that I think everyone can really take back to their teams. This is great. As we wrap up, is there any sort of like, if I had a nickel for every time, right? Is there like the most costly mistake or the most common mistake that you see either startups make or engineering leaders at large make that you want to kind of share some insights on how to kind of sidestep one of the biggest things that you come across in your
Mm-hmm.
leadership?
Yeah, I think we're kind of going through a moment as an industry, or maybe it's been a little bit longer than a moment here,
Yeah, at one moment.
where we've been shifting gears from a growth at all costs, which has had tremendous implications on process. We hire more, we onboard more, we grow more, we do all kinds of things, to maybe a more efficiency focus, or more being able to do more with less or the same. And I think that transition is very hard. It makes us question a lot of our fundamentals and assumptions. And I think that the thing that I see people making the most mistakes with is to assume that the new world looks a lot like the old world. Maybe because it feels safe, maybe it's because it's what we know. But at least right now, what I think leaders and engineering leaders especially would benefit from is more focus on understanding their business, understanding their business's structure, the things that keep your executives up at night. Probably have a lot to do with your cash burn and your bank balance and a whole bunch of things that maybe you haven't had to think about as an engineering leader. And making sure that you are adjusting, let's say, your risk list to compensate for the fact that if the company unexpectedly spends a bunch more money because engineering did something, that might have implications on headcount.
And I think the connecting the lines, it's okay and valued to ask for insight into data that you might not have had before.
From the business?
Right.
Yes.
Because if you're not used to thinking about things, chances are that you haven't seen the data. And maybe a certain set of people were looking at data when it was growth at all costs, and now that the growth equation has changed, maybe as engineering leaders, it's our job to request these data sets. What is our profit forecast? What is our cash position? What is our revenue growth? Right? What is our P&L? Right? And really almost like expand the finance, the education around the finances of the business, so that we can then do our jobs and form those stage appropriate processes, right? Because if we don't have the data, then we're making inferences, and that's a whole mess in and of itself. So I think it's like, all right, it's okay to think about things differently, and in order to think about things differently, we might need access to data that we haven't had before. Do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely.
Is that
and
a fair
I think
statement?
that a good place to start, if you can get it, is a copy of your board decks.
Yeah.
Ask your CEO if they'll share
I love that.
what they're sharing with the board. Ask your head of sales to give you a walkthrough of like the pipeline. Get a little bit more product curious. Make friends with BI. The people who are like on the ground, like with the numbers, can often like tell you a lot.
Yep. No, this is I love that we ended on this, because that's something so valuable. It's really the importance of like a real 360-degree business education, right? On the job education is really critical and a valuable skill. With that, I will say it's sadly time to wrap up, but this has been really insightful and eye-opening, and I appreciate your time, and thank you so much for being with us, Don.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you for having me.
Take care.